what makes Zilla 2004 so important to the story is that because of his creations and his art, which obviously creating his own monsters is no easy thing to do, it inspired JJS to make Goron in the first place. However, it didn't stop there. After collaborating with Zilla 2004 for the first time, and during this early collaboration period, obviously JJS was also teaming up with other YouTubers such as Commander M and Jagger Pro and all of them. Each one of these people were more than willing to help contribute to this new growing Goron universe with one film and now one in the making comic to come. So, with nothing else to do, there was one more thing left, and that was Rakushi himself. Rakushi had been confirmed to be implemented into the next Goron project. But how would he even show up? Well, in the midst of the story, after the Gorons defeat the humans on the islands and take over for themselves, all is somewhat peaceful in the following years. Of course, there are some major territorial battles between the monsters, but other than that, besides basking in the sun and hiding out from others, these things are just relatively peaceful. That is until the arrival of the monsters who came from the stars, the ones who were born in the stars, and I mean that literally, because the alien biology of this separate universe's Rakushi is unlike anything seen before. Except this Rakushi is not alone. As it turns out, there were thousands of Rakushis, an entire breeding populace of them, asexually reproducing 150-meter tall giants who dwarf the 80 to 50-meter tall Gorons in size. And at first place, it looked like, obviously, they stood no chance. Now, in terms of Goron versus Rakushi, any normal person would just say that Rakushi hands down demolishes Goron in combat. But in this timeline, the Gorons are obviously a lot stronger, and this is a much weaker variation of Rakushi. They have been stripped of most of their physical prowess and durability. Not only that, but even though Goron himself is insanely light for his size and therefore quick and agile, so are the Rakushis, who are mostly hollow bones for flight, are only 80,000 to 90,000 metric tons, when any other monster their size would weigh a good 10 to 50,000 tons heavier. This gives Goron somewhat of an advantage. Other than that though, the Gorons are physically extremely strong, as super strength is just one of their many abilities to come, and this is the first true appearance of said super strength. Although it truly appeared when the original Goron lifted the 30,000 ton London Bridge, and obviously I think it's a 20,000 to 50,000 ton Big Ben with no difficulty whatsoever. So weights and lifting have a lot to do with the Goron franchise. Continuing our story where we left off, after years of fighting, the conflict comes to a stalemate, with the remaining Rakushis flying off to their planet after taking a significant loss of their numbers. However, by the time the Gorons had finished, there were only around 3 Gorons left, each dispersed in different locations around the planet, known as First Generation Goron, Second Generation Goron, and of course the Junior Goron, who appears later on. But perhaps I've said too much. Anyway, that is where monster warfare finally comes to an end, and it's quite the expensive, bombastic, unique comic installment that the franchise needed at the time. But other than that, it was a valiant success, a great success actually, nearly as successful as the first film as time went on. Lots of people went back to watch this film as it had a lot of impact, obviously. But the next project will be very, very different, and it would actually be insanely cool. This is, of course, the novelisation. Goron, the monster that never thinks twice, a novelised adaptation, 2024. So how would this come about? Well, after hearing the critics and reviews, eventually JJS decided to write a novelised adaptation of the original film, adding one book to this ever-growing franchise. The book would obviously have a lot of changing elements in it too. Goron would be a lot more violent in the book than he is in, obviously, the movie, and a lot of scenes like, obviously, the hunters getting killed off one by one in the novel, that doesn't happen in the film. Goron is a lot harder to really like, and despite the fight scene against the military in the last, obviously in the film being short, this one is only slightly longer, I believe. The book is around a 1 hour and 10-minute read, or therefore it would take 4 more minutes longer to read the book than it would to watch the movie. So a worthy sacrifice, I'd say. Other than that, this is probably JJS's greatest piece of literature, besides from the retro manga comic franchise, and it would inspire him to make even more books across the line. So therefore, yes, the original Goron novelisation, being one of the first literary projects after The Lost New World, Part 1 through 3, would inspire the creation of a lot of things, including, but not limited to, Dread Lizard, and of course, you guessed it, the infamous Megalodon novel, Abyssal Giant, The Megalodon Lives On. But other than that, yeah, that's the history of the original Goron novelisation, and it's a pretty cool one at that. The themes of poverty and obviously Goron's physical prowess are also accentuated to make his powers more clearer than they were in the film. He is less of a curious monster, and a lot of the old lore is actually explored, including the giant fossilised bones found from the Monster Warfare comics, which is a nice homage, and of course the Sound of the 60s, which is an event that took place throughout the 60s where huge 180 decibel roaring sounds were heard straight to London or all around that perimeter, coming straight from Isla Monsteras, or Monsterland. Monsterland is of course home to Goron, and therefore we can make the quick conclusion that Goron was the one making these sounds. But other than that, the book is one of the main highlights of this franchise, obviously. And I genuinely believe that this book, I'd say, is really good. It's definitely better than the original film, and probably slightly better than Monster Warfare, I'd say. It's worth the read. But anyway, nonetheless, we might as well carry on from this point onwards and talk about the next project after this, which is of course the second Goron movie, The Return of Goron. So, how did this film come into conception? And well, it's actually really cool. Set 3 years after the events of the original film, and with no confirmed novelisation yet in sight as of current, The Return of Goron was obviously a big adaptation. It was set 3 years later and showed Ned dealing with his PTSD from the attack. He's become an astronomer, which he finds more interesting, and is now no longer grappling with poverty anymore. Him and Gabrielle are completely separated since the fallout of the original film and the book. And not only that, but obviously his heart is shattered by his best friend Daniel's death. It really does affect him, and you can see throughout this film, and even throughout some of Versus Melbelius too, which is really, really well illustrated, I'd say, and shows how someone will deal with grief even 3 years or a long time after a loved one or friend dies off. And grief is one of the main hit points of this new film, instead of poverty or curiosity. But besides that, he ends up getting dragged into a new operation by a new company who gets introduced into the franchise and become very important later on. This is, of course, Zero X, or Operation X, more formally speaking, owned by a mysterious man who just calls himself Operatives or Mr. Operatives. Not only that, but there is a military guy in this film who's just the generic general. Literally, he's just called General. That's all he's called. And to be honest, it's quite boring. This film is quite a snowfest, I must say, but whenever one of the two monsters are on screen, it's epic. Anyway, Ned ends up helping Operation X name a new mineral, or object in a sense, a smaller organism around half the size of a man, which is confirmed to be breathing and actually has little traces of nucleuses inside. An suspected alien life form that crashed onto Earth, known as Lifeform X or Organism X. It's named that way because of the business who discovered it, which is basically an overgrown version of the kaiju center from the original film, which is absent from this film, of course. Anyway, Lifeform X is just one of many, and they all end up combining to create stems or giant tendrils all around the world. Well, at least all around the northern hemisphere anyway, because they eventually combine to make the heart of this, and essentially a giant monster world tree. Goron's first true monster, or original opponent to face against, Astrophius. Astrophius is easily one of the most best and coolest designs this franchise has seen since the Rakushis. And honestly, as the fourth project in this franchise, Astrophius is a pretty cool threat. After laying waste to literally an entire, obviously, part of the overgrown London city, which is still suffering even 3 years after the original Goron attacked, and obviously that Goron died. However, there is hinted at being even more destruction on the way, because after Astrophius quickly flees the scene, another monster appears and takes down a naval boat, or at least a fishing boat. This monster is, of course, our second generation Goron, living it out somewhere in the Irish seas. Second generation Goron is even cooler than the last one, despite being the exact same size, at 9,126 tons, 80 metres in height, and of course the iconic 160 metres in length. This Goron is obviously a lot more formidable and angrier looking at first. He's had a big redesign with a turtle shell on his chest for whatever reason. One of the more iconic bits of the later Goron design throughout the next two films tied to the original, Goron vs. Melbelius and the Return of Goron, that is. And of course, he has a lot more battle scars from obviously this film, where he gets them later on from his later fight with Astrophius. Anyways, moving back into where we were, Goron destroys this boat, or this fishing vessel if you will, and then makes his way to the shoreline, where he seems unstoppable on the shores of London City and ready to repeat it again. Or perhaps he is lured here because generals, operatives, Ned, and obviously that's pretty much it really. These three end up watching one last climactic showdown, and the first time we see Goron fight another monster on screen, and not in a novelisation or comic book. And this is pretty cool. The fight between Goron and Astrophius is dark, and obviously you can barely see it, but it's still pretty memorable, the parts you can see and the parts you can remember. Parts where you can remember, it's obviously Goron getting a few good hits in. He's literally running circles around the weaker, slower Astrophius. But Astrophius still has that sheer size advantage, energy absorption on his side, and of course, energy production. For those who don't know Astrophius' powers, he's about 140 metres tall, or 10 metres shorter than the Rakushis. That might make you feel less threatening, but she's actually more threatening in this universe. she can produce electric beams, or electricity lasers as you call them, to slice through any opponents at any one given time, even the military and the humans. But the reason she created them, obviously all these limbs everywhere, is because she's absorbing electricity, and she's actually draining the entire northern hemisphere and eventually the southern hemisphere for all of the electricity and energy that it has. Once it finishes, there will be no energy all around the planet, and she would have grown into a massive cosmic being. And at one point, this seemed like this was obviously going to be the truth, with Goron having a massive internal blood bleed when he gets struck by this hyper-powerful electricity beam, anywhere from 20,000 to 50,000 degrees Celsius to be exact, in just one strike. It launches him over 4 miles away, 2 to 4 miles to be exact. And Goron can barely move, but instead he does something we haven't seen him do before. He crafts a wooden spear from a giant tree, and then obviously charges back into battle. This wooden spear, or the spear for short, is the one thing that helps second generation Goron, or second gen Goron for short, win and absolutely demolish Astrophius in physical prowess and combat. He ends up tearing Astrophius to shreds, digging through the nucleus with his spear, and then chucking her in the air, and then shattering all her body parts as soon as she hits the floor under her full 200,000 ton weight. Which means that Goron should be able to lift 20.1 times his own body weight, maybe even slightly more than that. So his super strength is now at full show by the time the fourth project arrives. But we are not even done yet, because after this, Goron shows off one more cool ability before leaving. He absorbs all of the thermal energy and electric energy to enter a supercharged state after killing, obviously, Astrophius. This is, of course, his supercharged Goron state and form. He ends up leaving at 100 meters taller and 16,126 metric tons, or to be exact, 5,000 tons heavier. So, Goron's supercharged ability makes him 5,000 tons heavier and about 20 meters taller, or 60 to 66 feet to be exact. Goron ends up leaving, and that is obviously the best ending possible. However, there is technically a slightly more unrelated part of the Goron franchise, which is, of course, Tales of the Contagion, the Host, the second comic book related to Goron, and basically a direct prequel to The Return of Goron, or Goron 2 if you will. So, what is this about? Well, it focuses around a group of people in Egypt, a pair of men who are just looking for ancient artifacts in a simple pyramid type setting. So what will this have to do with either Astrophius or Goron at this rate? Well, it actually does have something to do with it, because as it turns out, an ancient pharaoh's body actually became victim for some of this life form eggs, which does make a return in the Dread Lizard book, where it mutates a T-Rex into a monstrous killing machine. So, in a sense, Dread Lizard could technically be a prequel to Goron, if you would see it that way. Although it's more up to interpretation, that Dread Lizard, and it's more commonly accepted that this is just a different universe, but with the same life form or organism X in it. Now, after covering Dread Lizard, which is obviously a later on creation by Just Jurassic Studios, probably around 2025 to 2026 creation or novelization, and a 45-minute read, not a 70-minute read like the original Goron. So pretty impressive. But anyway, obviously this is part of the Kaiju Global Saga, this comic book, this Tales of the Contagion. You end up discovering the man has fallen victim to him and become the host. He ends up tearing apart the entire pyramid under it just to get these two. They both escaped, but the artifact ends up entering the possession of Zero X, or Operation X, and operatives ends up owning this. All of this is set in 1915. It's quite a margin shorter than obviously the original 15-page Goron comic book installment. But as the second comic, it's pretty impressive too, and pretty cool as well. Obviously, it explains a lot of early on Operation X, how they met the first life form X in the form of the host and the tendrils known as the stems. And yeah, pretty cool nonetheless. But other than that, that is the end of this new part. So without a doubt, let's continue.